In California's Central Valley, where endless crops feed America, one federal census worker discovered that some people prefer to remain uncounted. On the evening of October 13, 2020, Maria Santos loaded her government-issued clipboard into the front seat of her white Chevrolet Malibu and pulled away from the Tulare County Census Bureau field office for what would be her final shift. The 34-year-old federal enumerator had been conducting door-to-door interviews for the delayed 2020 census count, focusing on the hardest-to-reach populations in California's Central Valley. Maria's supervisor, Janet Chen, had assigned her Route 47B that Tuesday evening, a collection of rural addresses scattered across 23 square miles of agricultural land east of Pixley Township. These weren't the neat suburban streets where most census work took place. Route 47B consisted of unnamed dirt roads, labor camps tucked behind processing plants, and farm worker housing that existed in the gray areas between official zoning maps and federal documentation requirements. Maria was methodical, Chen would later tell investigators. She kept detailed notes, cross-referenced addresses with GPS coordinates, and always called in at the end of her shift. In 18 months of census work, she'd never missed a check-in. That October evening, Maria's route would take her through a landscape that most Californians never see. Past the Instagram-ready farmers markets and wine country, the Central Valley reveals itself as an industrial food production zone. Endless rows of almond trees stretch toward distant mountains. Irrigation canals slice through former wetlands with mechanical precision. And scattered throughout this vast agricultural grid are the places where the people who harvest America's food actually live. Maria's first stops were at the Riverside Labor Camp, a collection of converted barracks that housed seasonal workers during the almond harvest. Her bilingual skills made her invaluable for these interviews. Unlike many federal employees, she understood that asking someone to identify themselves to the government carried different meanings depending on their immigration status, their history with authorities, their trust in bureaucratic promises of confidentiality. According to Census Bureau GPS records, Maria completed interviews at 7 official addresses between 6:15 and 9:30 p.m. She documented 43 individuals across multiple households, noting discrepancies between listed occupancy and actual residence. Her final logged GPS coordinate placed her at 36.0847 degree north, 119.2156 degree west, near the intersection of Road 128 and Avenue 56 at 9:47 p.m. This location made no sense to investigators. The GPS coordinates placed Maria's vehicle beside an irrigation canal in an area with no residential addresses, no official census locations, and no reason for a federal enumerator to be conducting interviews. Yet security footage from a nearby almond processing plant would later show her white Malibu driving slowly along the canal road at 11:47 p.m., nearly 2 hours after her final official stop. At dawn on October 14th, a worker from the Mid-Valley Irrigation District found Maria's rental car parked beside the concrete-lined canal. The driver's side door stood open. Her federal ID badge lay on the passenger seat. Her clipboard of census forms was scattered across the ground, pages fluttering in the morning breeze that carries the scent of almond hulls and pesticides across the valley floor. Maria Santos was nowhere to be found. The scene suggested neither accident nor struggle. Her purse remained in the car, credit cards and cash untouched. Her cell phone sat on the dashboard, battery dead. The vehicle showed no damage, no signs of mechanical failure, no evidence of collision or force. It was as if Maria had simply stepped out of the car and walked away into the vast agricultural darkness that surrounds these rural roads like an ocean. But Maria Santos was not the type of person to abandon her responsibilities or her meticulous federal paperwork. And in a landscape where every acre is mapped, surveyed, and documented for maximum agricultural efficiency, how does someone simply disappear? To understand what happened to Maria Santos, investigators first had to understand the complex challenge she faced, accurately counting people who often preferred to remain uncounted. The 2020 census, already delayed by the pandemic, faced particular difficulties in agricultural regions where populations shift seasonally and documentation exists in bureaucratic gray areas. Counting farm workers isn't like counting suburbanites, explained Dr. Rebecca Martinez, a demographics researcher at UC Davis who studied Central Valley population patterns. You're dealing with families who move between states following harvest seasons, workers who live in unofficial housing arrangements, and communities where any interaction with federal officials carries potential risks. Maria's census forms, recovered from the scene and later analyzed by federal investigators, revealed the scope of these challenges. Her interview notes documented significant discrepancies between official address records and actual occupancy. Where county records listed single-family residences, Maria found converted garages housing 3 families. Where zoning maps showed agricultural land, she discovered rows of mobile homes connected to illegal electrical hookups. Most telling were her notations about what census supervisors called ghost addresses. These were locations that appeared on federal databases but didn't correspond to actual housing. Maria had flagged 17 such addresses on Route 47B alone, along with detailed notes about who was actually living where. The Riverside labor camp, where Maria conducted several interviews that final evening, exemplified these documentation challenges. Camp Supervisor Roberto Valdez explained the facility's complex population dynamics to investigators. We have 96 official beds, but during peak harvest, we might house 150 people. Families double up. Friends share bunks. Workers sleep in shifts. How do you count that for the federal government? Valdez described how workers move between camps throughout the valley, following different crop schedules. Almond harvest in October, citrus picking in winter, spring vegetables, summer processing work. Many maintained addresses in multiple states, carried identification documents that might not match their current location, or shared housing arrangements that defied easy categorization. Maria understood this complexity, Valdez told investigators. She didn't just count heads. She asked about family structures, seasonal movement patterns, permanent versus temporary residence. She was building a picture of how people actually live, not just checking boxes. But Maria's detailed documentation extended beyond the official labor camps. Her notes referenced interviews at locations that didn't appear on any Census Bureau maps. Private residences where farm owners had converted outbuildings into unofficial rental units. Trailer parks tucked behind equipment storage facilities. Housing that existed in the spaces between agricultural zoning and residential development. Federal investigators reviewing Maria's work discovered that she had been documenting systematic undercounting across her assigned region. Her preliminary data suggested the official population count for rural Tulare County was off by as much as 30%. In a state where federal funding formulas, congressional representation, and agricultural support programs all depend on accurate census numbers, such discrepancies carried significant financial implications. Every uncounted person represents lost federal dollars, explained Census Bureau Regional Director Thomas Park. Schools, hospitals, infrastructure projects, agricultural assistance programs, they're all allocated based on official population counts. If Maria was right about the undercounting, we're talking about millions of dollars in federal funding that wasn't reaching these communities. But the flip side of undercounting presented equally complex problems. Agricultural landowners faced strict regulations about housing density, worker safety standards, and zoning compliance. Accurate population counts could expose violations of occupancy limits, trigger inspections of housing conditions, or reveal employment practices that skirted federal labor regulations. Maria's investigation notes, scattered beside her abandoned car, included references to conversations with workers who expressed fear about being counted. Immigration status remained a constant concern despite federal assurances about census confidentiality. Some families worried that accurate documentation might lead to increased scrutiny from other government agencies. Others feared that revealing their actual living situations might jeopardize their housing arrangements. She was caught between competing interests, observed immigration attorney Patricia Reyes, who worked with Central Valley agricultural communities. Workers who needed to be counted for their communities to receive adequate federal support, but who were afraid of the consequences of visibility. Property owners who benefited from federal agricultural programs, but didn't want too much attention on how they housed their workforce. The day before Maria's disappearance, she had submitted a preliminary report to the Census Bureau flagging systematic documentation irregularities in her assigned region. The report, later obtained by investigators, recommended expanded enumeration efforts and suggested that standard census methodology was inadequate for accurately counting transient agricultural populations. What Maria couldn't have known was that her meticulous documentation was creating an official record of discrepancies that various parties had strong incentives to keep unofficial. In a region where agriculture generates billions of dollars annually and federal programs provide crucial support for both agribusiness and worker communities, accurate population counts weren't just academic exercises. They were economic and political battlegrounds. Somewhere in the gap between who was counted and who existed lay the answer to Maria Santos' disappearance. 3 days after Maria Santos' disappearance, federal investigators began to understand that her census work had inadvertently documented far more than population numbers. Her detailed notes revealed a complex web of agricultural economics, where water rights, federal subsidies, and population counts intersected in ways that made accurate enumeration both crucial and potentially dangerous. Water rights attorney Margaret Chen, who represented several large agricultural operations in Tulare County, explained the high stakes involved. In California agriculture, everything comes down to water allocation and federal support programs. Population counts determine congressional representation, which influences agricultural policy. They affect federal funding formulas that support rural infrastructure, the roads, the processing facilities. Maria's census forms documented housing arrangements that raised serious questions about land use compliance. Federal agricultural subsidies, crop insurance programs, and water allocation rights all depended on accurate reporting of land use categories. Property zoned for agricultural use received different treatment under federal programs than those classified as residential or mixed-use development. She was finding residential populations on land that was supposed to be exclusively agricultural, explained County Planning Director James Kovac. Labor housing is allowed under agricultural zoning, but there are strict density limits, safety requirements, and reporting obligations. If Maria's counts were accurate, some operations were housing 2 or 3 times the legally permitted number of residents. The implications extended beyond zoning violations. Federal crop insurance programs, which provide crucial protection for agricultural investments, required accurate reporting of land use and population density. Housing too many workers on agricultural land could jeopardize insurance coverage worth millions of dollars annually. Moreover, water rights in the Central Valley operated under a complex system where usage allocation partially depended on documented need and population served. Agricultural operations with larger documented populations could justify higher water allocations, but only if that population was legally housed and properly reported to authorities. Maria's investigation had uncovered what appeared to be systematic gaming of these systems. Her notes described properties that reported minimal residential population to maintain agricultural zoning and water rights, while actually housing significant numbers of workers in conditions that violated occupancy and safety standards. The economics are straightforward, observed agricultural economist Dr. Stephen Park from California State University, Fresno. Federal agricultural support programs provide billions in subsidies, crop insurance, and disaster relief. Water rights are worth millions per acre-foot in dry years. Congressional representation influences how these programs are structured and funded. Accurate population counts could shift all of these equations. Investigators discovered that Maria's preliminary census data had been circulated beyond the Census Bureau. Her supervisor, Janet Chen, had shared Maria's findings with county officials as part of routine coordination between federal and local agencies. From there, information about systematic undercounting and housing violations had reached multiple parties with financial interests in maintaining the existing system. Particularly concerning were Maria's notes about phantom addresses, locations that appeared on federal databases but housed no actual residents. These addresses were being used to justify federal funding for rural infrastructure projects, including road maintenance, telecommunications upgrades, and agricultural facility improvements. If the addresses were fraudulent, millions in federal infrastructure spending could be at risk. The Mid-Valley Agricultural Cooperative, which coordinated operations for 37 farming operations in the region, had been receiving federal grants for rural community development based on population figures that Maria's work suggested were significantly inflated. Cooperative Director Michael Torres adamantly denied any intentional misrepresentation. Census data has always been problematic in agricultural areas, Torres told investigators. Seasonal populations, transient workers, informal housing arrangements. These are realities of agricultural labor that don't fit neat federal categories. We report what we know based on the best information available. But Maria's notes suggested more deliberate manipulation. She'd had documented conversations with workers who described being instructed to provide specific addresses for federal documentation that didn't match where they actually lived. Some workers maintained official addresses at properties where they hadn't lived for years, while their actual housing went unreported. Federal Agricultural Inspector David Reeves, who worked closely with census data for compliance monitoring, described the broader implications. Agricultural operations depend on federal programs for everything from crop insurance to infrastructure development. But these programs require accurate reporting of population, land use, and housing density. If operations were systematically misrepresenting these numbers, we're looking at potential fraud across. The financial stakes were enormous. Tulare County's agricultural operations generated over $4.80 billion annually, supported by hundreds of millions in federal subsidies, insurance programs, and in infrastructure investments. Congressional representation based on accurate population counts influenced how these federal programs were structured and funded at the national level. Maria Santos had stumbled into a system where accurate counting threatened to expose widespread violations of federal agricultural, housing, and labor regulations. Her methodical documentation threatened to unravel financial arrangements worth millions of dollars annually. Investigators would later discover that in the 2 weeks before Maria's disappearance, several agricultural operations had contacted county officials expressing concerns about overly intrusive census procedures. Some had requested that federal enumeration be conducted only during specific hours or through designated representatives. The question investigators faced was whether Maria had been warned away from her thorough documentation practices, and what had happened when she refused to compromise the accuracy of her federal reporting responsibilities. The physical evidence from Maria Santos's abandoned vehicle told a story that investigators struggled to understand. Her scattered census forms, analyzed by federal document experts, revealed meticulous note-taking that continued until the very moment she disappeared, and raised troubling questions about what she had discovered in her final hours. Maria's clipboard contained completed interview forms for 7 official addresses, but also included handwritten notes about locations that didn't appear on any Census Bureau maps. Her GPS device, recovered from the car's glove compartment, showed a troubling pattern of movement during her final evening. According to GPS records analyzed by FBI technical specialists, Maria had deviated significantly from her assigned route. After completing her official interviews by 9:30 p.m., she had driven to at least 4 undocumented locations, spending between 15 and 30 minutes at each site. The coordinates led investigators to properties that existed in bureaucratic gray areas, neither fully agricultural nor residential, neither fully documented nor completely hidden. Her GPS shows she was conducting unauthorized interviews, explained Census Bureau Regional Security Director Patricia Walsh. Federal enumerators are required to stick to assigned addresses and follow strict protocols for documenting any deviations. Maria was an experienced employee who understood these rules. For her to go off route like this suggests she had discovered something that couldn't wait for official channels. The most puzzling GPS coordinate placed Maria's vehicle at the West Side Pumping Station, a remote irrigation facility that operated automatically and normally housed no personnel. Security cameras from a nearby almond processing plant captured her white Malibu at this location at 11:47 p.m., nearly 2.5 hours after her final official interview. Pumping station operator Carlos Mendez told investigators that the facility was unmanned during evening hours, with access limited to irrigation district employees and agricultural lessees. "There's nothing there but machinery and water channels," Mendez explained. "No housing, no reason for census work. If someone was there at midnight, they were meeting someone or looking for something specific." Investigators discovered that the pumping station sat at the intersection of multiple property boundaries, with agricultural land leased by 3 different operations converging near the facility. More significantly, county records showed that temporary housing permits had been issued for all 3 properties, but Maria's census data suggested no residential population in the area. Analysis of Maria's scattered paperwork revealed partially completed interview forms that didn't match any addresses on her official route. These forms contained demographic information for 17 individuals, including children, but lacked location identifiers or property addresses. The handwriting appeared rushed, unlike Maria's typically neat documentation. Most troubling were Maria's handwritten margin notes on these unofficial forms. Phrases like "no legal address," "moved 3 times," and "afraid to provide info" suggested she had encountered a hidden population that existed outside official documentation systems. FBI handwriting analysts confirmed that all of the paperwork was completed by Maria, but noted unusual characteristics in her final notes. "The handwriting shows signs of stress or urgency," explained document examiner Dr. Lisa Chang. "Letter formation becomes less consistent. Spacing is irregular, and there are several instances where she started to write something and then crossed it out completely." One partially completed form contained a note that investigators found particularly significant. "Family of 6. Children born here. No SNs. Employer provides housing but not on any county records." The form was left incomplete, with no signatures or address information. Maria's cell phone records revealed another troubling detail. At 10:23 p.m., she had attempted to call her supervisor, Janet Chen, but the call went to voicemail. She didn't leave a message. Phone company records showed that her device had adequate signal strength and battery power at that time, suggesting she chose not to explain what she had discovered. 10 minutes later, at 10:33 p.m., Maria's phone received an incoming call from an unlisted number. The call lasted 47 seconds. Phone company records couldn't identify the caller, but cell tower data placed both phones within a 2-mile radius of the pumping station where her car was later found. Someone contacted Maria during her unauthorized investigation. FBI telecommunications specialist agent Robert Kim told investigators. The timing suggests either someone was monitoring her movements or someone she had interviewed was calling her back. Either scenario indicates her census work had attracted attention from parties who preferred to remain uncounted. Security footage from agricultural facilities along Maria's route provided additional pieces of the puzzle. Cameras at the Sunrise Almond processing plant showed her vehicle passing the facility 3 separate times between 10:45 p.m. and 11:30 p.m., suggesting she was circling the area or making multiple stops at nearby locations. The final piece of physical evidence was perhaps the most unsettling. Maria's federal identification badge, found on the passenger seat of her abandoned car, showed signs of recent handling. But fingerprint analysis revealed prints that didn't match Maria's. "Someone else handled her ID badge after Maria did," explained FBI forensics specialist agent Sarah Martinez. "The prints were clear, recent, and belonged to someone not in our database. This suggests Maria didn't abandon the vehicle voluntarily. Someone else was present when her identification was removed." The evidence painted a picture of a federal employee who had discovered something significant enough to abandon proper procedures and continue investigating into the night. But whatever Maria had found at those undocumented locations, whoever had called her phone, and whatever had drawn her to the remote pumping station remained mysteries. What was clear was that Maria Santos had been documenting people in places that someone wanted to keep hidden, and that her commitment to accurate federal reporting had led her into danger she may not have recognized until it was too late. 3 days into the investigation, FBI agent Patricia Morales arrived in Pixley with a team of federal investigators and a growing sense of frustration. The Census Bureau took the disappearance of their employees seriously, particularly when it involved potential interference with the constitutional mandate to count every person in America. But from her first interview at the Tulare County Sheriff's Office, Agent Morales encountered a problem that would plague the entire investigation: language. The vast majority of agricultural workers in the area spoke Spanish as their primary language, with many speaking indigenous languages from Oaxaca and Guatemala. Local deputies, overwhelmed by their regular caseload, had limited Spanish language skills. "We're talking about a population that's largely invisible to begin with," explained Carmen Rodriguez, a community advocate with the Central Valley Farm Worker Coalition. "These are people who work 12-hour days in the fields, live in overcrowded housing, and send most of their money back home. The last thing they want is contact with any government official, even one trying to help them." The challenge went deeper than simple translation. When federal agents finally located interpreters and began conducting interviews, they discovered that many potential witnesses were reluctant to speak about Maria Santos at all. Some claimed they had never seen her. Others provided vague, inconsistent accounts that seemed designed to end the conversation quickly. Jose Martinez, who managed a labor camp 2 miles from where Maria's car was found, initially told investigators through an interpreter that no census worker had visited his facility. But when Agent Morales returned with Maria's supervisor, Janet Chen, Martinez's story changed. He remembered Maria clearly. She had spent nearly 2 hours at the camp on her final day, carefully documenting the number of people living in each trailer. "She spoke perfect Spanish," Martinez admitted in his second interview. "Better than mine, actually. She could talk to the Guatemalan families in their own language, too. That's why people trusted her. She wasn't just another government person who couldn't understand them." This revelation troubled the investigators. Maria's bilingual abilities, which made her invaluable for accurate census counting, might have also put her at risk. Unlike other census workers who conducted brief interviews through language barriers, Maria could have deeper conversations. She could ask follow-up questions. She could understand answers that residents might not want government officials to hear. Agent Morales learned that Maria had been specifically assigned to the most challenging enumeration areas, places where previous census workers had reported incomplete counts or suspected undercounting. Her supervisor, Janet Chen, explained that Maria had a gift for building trust with immigrant communities. Maria understood that for many of these families, being counted meant being seen, Chen told investigators. But it also meant being vulnerable. She was very careful about explaining confidentiality protections, about making sure people understood that census data couldn't be shared with immigration authorities. But as Agent Morales dug deeper, she discovered that Maria's final week of work had yielded troubling discrepancies. Census forms from the same addresses showed different occupancy numbers from day to day. Some forms indicated that Maria had returned to the same location multiple times, each visit revealing additional residents who hadn't been initially disclosed. Dr. Roberto Gonzalez, a sociology professor at UC Merced who studied agricultural labor patterns, explained the complexity of counting transient populations. You have families who move between different labor camps following harvest seasons. You have multiple families sharing single-family housing. You have people who are literally afraid to answer their doors. And you have employers who sometimes prefer that certain housing arrangements remain unofficial. The language barrier extended beyond Spanish. Investigators learned that Maria had been using translation apps and gesture-based communication to interview families from Myanmar, Laos, and Ethiopia, part of a newer wave of agricultural workers recruited through federal refugee resettlement program. These communities were even more isolated, with virtually no local language resources available. Community leaders began reaching out to federal investigators directly, bypassing local law enforcement entirely. They shared a different picture of Maria's final days, one of a dedicated federal employee who had been asking increasingly specific questions about housing conditions, work arrangements, and the movement of people between different agricultural properties. She wanted to know about the buses, revealed Ana Gutierrez, a community health worker who had helped Maria with several interviews. Who was bringing workers from one farm to another? How long people stayed, where they went next? She said the numbers weren't adding up, that she was finding people who should have been counted somewhere else but weren't counted anywhere. As the investigation entered its second week, Agent Morales faced a troubling realization. The very skills that made Maria Santos effective at her job, her linguistic abilities, her cultural sensitivity, her persistence in getting accurate counts, may have led her to discover something that someone desperately wanted to keep hidden. But in a community where fear of deportation made people reluctant to speak to any government official, finding out what Maria had learned would prove nearly impossible. The language barrier wasn't just hindering the investigation. It was protecting whoever had wanted Maria Santos to disappear. On November 18, 2020, just as the search for Maria Santos was expanding beyond Tulare County, nature intervened in the worst possible way. A massive tulle fog bank rolled across the Central Valley, reducing visibility to less than 10 feet and grounding all aerial search operations. Tulle fog, a phenomenon unique to California's Central Valley, forms when cold air settles into the valley floor during winter months, creating a dense, ground-hugging layer that can persist for days or even weeks. For agricultural workers and commuters, it's a familiar seasonal hazard. For search and rescue operations, it's a nightmare. I have lived in the valley my whole life, and I have never seen fog this thick last this long, said Captain Steve Morrison of the Tulare County Sheriff's Search and Rescue Team. We had helicopters staged at 3 different airports, thermal imaging equipment, the whole works. But when you can't see your hand in front of your face, aircraft becomes useless. The fog arrived at the worst possible moment. Search teams had been methodically working their way through the agricultural grid surrounding Maria's abandoned rental car, following irrigation canals and drainage ditches that crisscrossed the landscape like a vast circulatory system. The terrain, flat and seemingly simple from above, proved treacherous on foot. Volunteer searcher David Kim described the challenge. People think it's just flat farmland, but it's incredibly complex down there. You have irrigation channels that are 8 feet deep, covered drainage pipes that create sinkholes, pesticide treatment areas that are off limits, and everything looks the same. Row after row, the same crops, the same dirt roads, the same concrete channels. The agricultural landscape that fed much of America had been engineered for efficiency, not search and rescue. Massive fields stretched for miles without landmarks, interrupted only by geometric patterns of crops and the linear infrastructure of industrial farming. GPS units became essential just to maintain position, and even experienced search teams found themselves disoriented in the monotonous agricultural grid. When the fog lifted on the 4th day, search teams discovered that the weather had created new complications. The moisture had softened the soil, making it impossible to determine if ground disturbances were recent or related to normal agricultural activity. Heavy machinery used for fall harvesting had left tracks everywhere, obliterating any potential evidence. Canine units faced particular challenges in the agricultural environment. Handler Jennifer Walsh explained the problems. Agricultural chemicals, fertilizers, pesticide residues, they overwhelm a dog's ability to track specific scents. We had cadavered dogs reacting to multiple locations, but we couldn't tell if they were detecting human remains or just responding to the chemical soup in the soil. The search expanded to include the extensive network of irrigation infrastructure beneath the visible landscape. Tulare County operates one of the most complex water management systems in California, with underground channels, pumping stations, and drainage systems that create a hidden geography beneath the agricultural surface. County Water District Supervisor Tom Bradley provided investigators with detailed maps of the subsurface infrastructure. Most people don't realize there's essentially another world down there, Bradley explained. Miles of concrete channels, access tunnels, pumping chambers. Some of these facilities haven't been inspected in years. Search teams began the dangerous work of exploring underground water management facilities. Using specialized cave rescue equipment, they descended into pumping stations and followed drainage channels that extended for miles beneath the agricultural landscape. The work was slow, dangerous, and complicated by seasonal water flows that could flood chambers with little warning. Meanwhile, agricultural equipment operators began reporting unusual findings. Tractor driver Miguel Hernandez contacted investigators after discovering disturbed soil near a drainage outfall 3 miles from Maria's car. The ground was different, he reported through an interpreter. Soft in a way that didn't match the irrigation patterns, like someone had been digging and then tried to make it look normal. But when investigators arrived to examine the site, they found the area had been recently disked and replanted. The property owner, Westside Agricultural Management, explained that the timing was part of their normal winter preparation schedule. No unusual activity, they insisted, just standard land management. Similar reports came from across the search area. A pesticide applicator noticed fresh excavation near a concrete channel. An irrigation technician reported broken vegetation along a remote access road. Each potential lead was investigated, but the vast scale of agricultural activity in the area made it impossible to distinguish between normal operations and potential evidence. The fog returned twice more during the critical first month of searching, each time halting operations for days. When visibility finally improved permanently in early December, the search area had been contaminated by weeks of continued agricultural activity, seasonal flooding, and the movement of heavy machinery. It's like trying to find evidence of a crime in the middle of a construction site that never stops operating, Agent Morales told reporters during a press briefing. The landscape changes constantly. Plowing, planting, harvesting, chemical treatments. If there was evidence on the surface, it's gone now. By December 15th, after nearly a month of intensive searching, teams had covered over 200 square miles of agricultural land, explored dozens of underground facilities, and followed every credible lead. They had found agricultural equipment, irrigation hardware, pesticide containers, and the remains of several farm animals. But they had found no trace of Maria Santos. The vast agricultural landscape of the Central Valley, which fed millions of Americans, seemed to have swallowed one federal census worker without leaving behind so much as a footprint. Whether nature or human intervention was responsible remained an open question, but the result was the same. Maria Santos had vanished into the fog, and the fog had closed behind her. Nearly 4 years have passed since Maria Santos disappeared from a remote agricultural road in Tulare County, and her case remains one of the most perplexing mysteries in the history of the U.S. Census Bureau. 3 primary theories have emerged from the investigation, each supported by compelling evidence, yet none providing definitive answers. The federal investigation, led by FBI agent Patricia Morales, concluded that Maria had likely uncovered systematic census fraud or labor law violations that threatened powerful agricultural interests. According to this theory, Maria's meticulous documentation of housing density violations, undocumented workers, and fraudulent address listings had put her in direct conflict with agribusiness operations worth millions of dollars. Census data drives federal funding allocation, congressional representation, and agricultural subsidy distribution, explained Dr. Sarah Chen, a public policy researcher at UC Davis who reviewed the case files. If Maria had documented systematic undercounting or overcounting in certain areas, it could have shifted millions of dollars in federal resources. That's motive for extreme measures. Supporting this theory was Maria's discovery of what her supervisor Janet Chen called ghost addresses, official census locations that didn't correspond to actual residential structures. Internal Census Bureau documents revealed that Maria had flagged over 30 such discrepancies in her final week of work, noting cases where her GPS coordinates didn't match the addresses on her assignment list. More troubling were Maria's notes about labor camp populations that seemed to fluctuate dramatically between her visits. On November 10th, she documented 12 adults and 5 children at a facility managed by Westside Agricultural Management. When she returned 3 days later, her forms showed only 4 adults and no children, but neighbors reported seeing the same families in the area throughout that period. Agent Morales believed that Maria had stumbled onto a sophisticated system for manipulating census counts to maximize federal agricultural subsidies while minimizing oversight of labor practices. But proving this theory required the cooperation of immigrant communities who remained afraid to speak with federal authorities, even years after Maria's disappearance. Local law enforcement agencies, however, developed a darker theory. Tulare County Sheriff Detective Ray Martinez believed that Maria had encountered human trafficking operations that used agricultural labor as cover for forced labor, or worse. The Central Valley's vast agricultural landscape, with its isolated farms and transient population, provided ideal conditions for criminal organizations. "We've broken up trafficking rings before that used legitimate agricultural operations as fronts," Detective Martinez explained during a 2022 interview. "Victims are moved between different farms, kept isolated, told that any contact with government officials will result in deportation. A census worker asking detailed questions about who lives where could have disrupted a very profitable criminal enterprise." This theory gained credibility when investigators discovered that several of the addresses on Maria's final route had been previously associated with labor trafficking investigations. In 2018, federal agents had raided a facility just 2 miles from where Maria's car was found, discovering workers living in conditions that prosecutors described as modern slavery. The trafficking theory also explained the sophisticated nature of Maria's disappearance. Unlike random crimes of opportunity, her vanishing suggested careful planning and the resources to eliminate all physical evidence. Criminal organizations with experience in human trafficking would possess both the motivation and capability to make someone disappear permanently. But agricultural industry representatives rejected both theories, instead proposing that Maria Santos had simply become lost in unfamiliar terrain during foggy conditions. John Davidson, spokesman for the Central Valley Agricultural Council, argued that investigators were overcomplicating a tragic but straightforward case. Ms. Santos was working alone in a vast agricultural area she didn't know well, during a season when tuile fog can reduce visibility to zero without warning. Davidson stated during a press conference in 2021. "The irrigation system in that area includes channels that are 15 feet deep with concrete sides. One misstep in heavy fog, and someone could fall and be swept away by water flows." This theory pointed to the challenging terrain and weather conditions that had hampered the search effort. The Central Valley's agricultural infrastructure included thousands of miles of irrigation channels, many unmarked and unguarded. During winter months, these channels carried significant water flows that could easily sweep away a person who fell in. Supporting the accident theory were witness reports of extremely dense fog on the night Maria disappeared, and the discovery of her car near a particularly complex intersection of irrigation channels. Additionally, Maria's GPS device showed that she had made several wrong turns in her final hours, suggesting disorientation in the agricultural grid. Yet significant questions remained unanswered by any of the theories. Why had Maria continued working hours past her scheduled shift? Why were her census forms scattered outside her vehicle rather than secured inside? How had she traveled to locations not on her official route? Most troubling was the fate of Maria's final census data. According to Census Bureau protocols, completed enumeration forms should have been submitted electronically each evening. But Maria's count data from her final 3 days of work never reached the federal database. Whether this was due to technical problems, deliberate interference, or other factors remains unknown. Janet Chen, Maria's supervisor, noted a bitter irony in the case. Maria dedicated her career to making sure that everyone gets counted, that no one gets overlooked by the federal government. Now she herself is missing from all the records. She's become one of the uncounted. The 2020 census was eventually completed without Maria's final data, but questions lingered about the accuracy of counts in the agricultural areas where she had been working. Several congressional representatives from California requested investigations into potential undercounting of rural and immigrant populations, but budget constraints and political priorities prevented comprehensive follow-up studies. Today, Maria Santos' case remains open with the FBI, the Census Bureau, and the Tulare County Sheriff's Office. Her rental car was eventually returned to the federal motor pool, her government-issued equipment redistributed to other census workers. But her final enumeration sheets, the ones that might have contained the information someone wanted to suppress, were never recovered. In the end, Both Maria Santos and the people she was trying to count remain missing from America's official records. Whether by accident, crime, or conspiracy, the 2020 census was completed without their voices. A reminder that in a democracy, some of the most important battles are fought not over who gets to vote, but over who gets counted at all.